Hello, Klotz here. I'm going to be walking you through my tune, The Shadow Realm, off of my last EP, the Trials EP, and sort of breaking down why I made some of the decisions I did and some of the sound design processes that I used along the way. So let me play some, and then we will get into it.
This is the nature of the Shadow Realm.
That's the idea. So let's talk about some angry noises, shall we? This tune I started probably 10 months before I actually finished it and released it. I was just trying to make some sort of growly, angry bass sounds, kind of like Scata by Skrillex, and this is what came out of those original ones. These sounds are not massively difficult to make. A lot of it's just sine waves and maybe some saw or square waves or some other growly wavetables, massively distorted and run through Serum's reverb filter. So if you're trying to make sounds like this, just crank a reverb filter onto something messy and then move the cutoff up and down. That's literally that. So the intro is those, and then I've got a little bit of a sweep between them to give it a sort of growl and then breathe in and then growl, breathe in feeling. I start the intro super minimally because I wanted this to be a sort of spiritual successor to my last track, Time Wizard, and I was using that to start a lot of my sets. I was using it as like a big intro track because it has a very nice little monologue at the beginning and then right into the build-up. So I wanted to sort of emulate that, but with an even longer version. So this one doesn't drop for a minute 15, which is normal. The last one, the version of Time Wizard I was starting with, dropped super quickly. So I made all these little intro pads just with Omnisphere. And then I used, I think, Serum, Omnisphere, and String Studio to make these little pluck strings. And so just layering them all together, you get this nice, like, intensity rising, but no distinct patterns. And that sweeps directly up into the growls. Drums in the beginning section are super simple. It's just a kick on each one when the growls start. The growls go to this long extended version, which is the same sound, just with some modulation. So here it is. 2 wavetables, FM'd a bunch, a little bit of movement just to keep them from being too static. And then this one I actually have a Combs filter on, and then I just modulate the cutoff a little bit. Underneath that, I have this sort of washy. You'll find that in this track, a lot of the sounds in it were sounds that I made for the drop, and then they weren't good enough to be the main sound, quote unquote, or something to really focus on, so they ended up becoming background elements for other parts of the track. So that was one of them. it was just too washy and white noisy, and instead of fixing it, I decided to just make it a build-up element. So there's that, and then there's this, which is the machine gun from the drop that I've been doing this a lot lately, and a lot of people do this, where you introduce a drop sound earlier in the build-up in like a lighter way. So there's not quite as much distortion and processing going on, but it's the same sound, so that just helps sort of build the intensity, all the drums, and then a big section for the vocal, and then right when it drops, you get this big washout of the machine guns. Okay, so here's how we created this one. Import a random wavetable, whatever it may be. It's very scratchy. Just give it a little bit of movement on the wavetable position. We FM it from a sub, so we have A, low end, because I know I want to distort the hell out of that later, and B, I can FM from it to make this a little more scratchy. Add some white noise, because in a gunshot, which is what I'm trying to emulate here, there's, you know, a lot of high end right at the beginning, and then mostly the ring out of the mids. And then throw a phased square on there as well to get more of the descending. And so we have, as you can see, the coarse, I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen, as if you can see where I'm pointing. We have the coarse pitch modulated by this as well, so you get that descending. Throw a low-high bandpass filter. A low and a high-pass filter together is basically a bandpass filter. We just have them modulated slightly differently. So the lower frequency moves, or the higher frequency moves a little bit, the lower frequency moves a lot. So we're getting closer, we're at like laser gun-y stage here. Once we've got the bandpass filter on, we'll throw on some hyper and dimension for a little bit of body, just a little bit. A lot of distortion. Now that's what I call gunshots, sort of. We, as well as this, the post means after the distortion, we have it doing a low pass, and we have the low pass moving down along this filter. So without that, super gritty and messy. So we throw the post on so that it just has the gritty high end at the beginning real quick, and then that goes away. Nice. Little EQ for movement. And reverb filter as always. You can really hear the difference in how metallic it sounds with and without. And it doesn't need a lot, just a little bit. Here it is, just a little bit. I just wanted the metallic here and not the rest of it. If you have it for the whole sound, it can, if you play the MIDI note longer, it can ring out ugly, so I like to have the reverb filter go back down after the sound is over. So we add some metallicness, and then, of course, a bunch of compression. So that's sounding relatively machine gunny, but I'm an asshole, so I want to ruin it even more. So first of all, we add a ton of saturation, because we still have that sub, and I know I wanted to wreck that. So we wreck the sub with a ton of saturation, then we add some downsampling to give us a little bit of crispy, crackly high end. And just the wet sounds like this. So we throw that on top, you know, make it sound super broken, overdrive that as well, you know, as if it wasn't messy enough. EQ to taste. Without this part, it sounds like this. But the sub was interfering with the sub in my other sound, so I cut the sub out. But then there's parts where the other sound sub isn't playing, and I still want low end. So what I did is manually automate, and you can see the automation here, the frequency of that, so that when the other sound sub is playing, this is high, and so it high passes the sub out of this sound. And then when the sub isn't playing for the other sound, I bring the high pass down, so the low end on the machine gun comes through, so it ends up sounding like this. So you only get the sub, you know, on the back half of these notes. Then some OTT, and I absolutely crush the sub that it's giving me. A little bit of EQ for mix down reasons, boost the volume a little bit, limit it because it was loud as shit. Even brought down 6.5 decibels, it's still clipping by 6 decibels. So way too loud, but this limiter actually, and it was intentionally super loud, smashing into the limiter gives you that extra layer of distortion that I wanted, so I'll hear you with and without. We do a washout later on. Well, we're not using it for this part. It's for this intro. If you don't know what bass clef's easy washout is, learn what it is and get it. It's free, but it's what makes that super washed out. Oh, let me turn these on. So it makes it sound far away and reverby and then like it's getting closer to you. So we use that for an effect for there. And then a little bit more mix down stuff. And that's the machine gun. One of the grossest post-processing chains that I've ever created. I do regret it. And if I had a chance to do it again, I would do it again. So that's the machine gun. The other main half, or the other half of the main sounds in the drop is this, and it has quite similar processing, but not necessarily the same. So here we are with this patch. I'm not sure if this might be the same wavetable, actually. I don't know. But we take 3 voices, and then we detune them a little bit, and we turn the random all the way down. So they all start in the same place, and then slowly drift apart, which gives us a sort of lasery sound like this. Then we go ahead and FM that from this guy, and I've turned the random all the way down because I don't want it going anywhere. I want it to sound the same consistently. We're going to go ahead and turn this filter on. 2 peaks moving away from each other, classic vowel sound. I knew that I wanted a growl to go with the machine gun, so that's classic vowel growl. Not much here, just a little EQ for movement, just a tiny bit. The sound really comes from post-processing in this one as well. So the first thing we do is go ahead and saturate it just a fuck ton. Just way too much. Throw some OTT on to rein it in a little bit. And then some EQ to take out the low end. As you can see, I fiddle with the EQ a lot, and instead of adjusting what I have, I like to add a new bell and work off that. So it's a little bit cleaner. It's still very distorted and growly, which I like for this song. We're going to downsample this one as well. We're going to downsample this one a lot. So what I'm doing here is low passing it so that you don't hear the high end, because downsampling adds a lot of high end. So if you downsample something with high end, it's going to get even noisier. So we downsample it here, but just the low end. So I low pass it and then downsample that sound and then mix that back in with some of the original sound. So it's nice and gritty now. Throw an OTT on it to really compress the highs, leave the lows and mids alone. Go ahead and EQ up the certain parts that I really want to come through. A little bit of stereo control, which just makes the low end mono because I was having issues with the low end on this one. We've got a washout here, which we do the same thing as the other one. A little bit of EQ for taste. Wide stereo is for later. Utility, we have to bring the volume down a ton because it's super loud. And then just a saturator with soft clipping on, just to make sure that the parts that are still, clipping a little bit get rolled off a little easier instead of going through the whole chain that loud and blowing everything else out. So when we combine it with the machine gun, oh, and by the way, the timing of the machine gun isn't an LFO. It's just me doing the MIDI, manually off-grid like that to give it that sort of wonkier feeling. That's the main part of the drop, but we do have a few sounds in the background. This is another sound that was intended to be for the drop and be a main sound for the drop, but it just wasn't good enough, so it got relegated to the background like everything else. So there's that one. And then over here we have some more that's much the same. So the machine guns changed to triplets in this section. The growl the downsampled growl becomes much longer, and then I add a little tremolo. So this is actually interesting. You can hear it start to wobble as it goes in. What that is this LFO modulating the cutoff and the frequency of the filter as well as the actual pitch of the main sound. And then I've routed them in the matrix to have 0 output, and then I manually automate them up. So at the beginning, this is outputting 0%. And then as these travel up, as you'll see in a second, they output more and more. So it wobbles more and more on those parameters. So it's a very hands-on manual control over how much wobble is actually going into the sound, and so I can adjust that throughout the song with however much I want it to be. I design a lot of sounds in ways that I can adjust them later and make variations a lot easier instead of locking things into the sound. I could have done that by mapping an envelope to it, but then maybe later if I want it to go faster, then I have to automate the envelope, and it's just easier for me to make a sound that I can change at a moment's notice. Other than that, the processing is very, very similar for that sound, a little bit less distorted. And then we add this layer in the background. So this layer is actually 2 layers and then vocoded against each other. So here we go, unfreeze. The first one is this guy. And it's not that much interesting in Serum. It's real quiet. What it mostly is a ton of OTT, especially in the highs, and then Yo Man. Yo Man is super, super important for making sounds like this. Then we go just a compressor to sidechain it because I wanted it to the volume to come down relative to what these were doing. This guy, however, if we turn the vocoder off and the growlify, super simple saw wave. We growlify it so that it becomes just an awful, godforsaken mess of a sound. Ew. Then we go ahead and I turn the gate off? I'm gonna turn the gate back on. We vocode it to the other sound that we were just listening to. So now we get... So the whole thing sits in the vocoder and how it's vocoded to that sound. Layer them together. You get this nice background sound that can just sit behind these machine guns and this main saw and create the whole body. This is another sound that I was designing for the main body of the drop, and then it wasn't good enough, so it got sent to the background, or the Shadow Realm, if you please. That is the entirety of the first drop. It fades away, it goes back down to super, super minimal. This is literally just a copy-paste of the first intro. The growls are exactly the same. So the sounds in the second drop are a little bit different than the sounds in the first drop. We'll start with this one. This is a sine wave, FM'd by a super scratchy sort of sine-ish wave, and then with this sort of shape for a distortion. As you can see, there's just a bunch more distortion, a little bit of EQ for movement, and then more saturation, compression, distortion. It's an awfully disgusting sound. And if you're just learning to sound design, I don't recommend this because it's 99.9% of the time that you make something like this, it's awful and it's not good to put in a track. I just made enough of them that I finally made one that was okay. This one and this one are very slight variations on the exact same thing. So I just duplicated it, changed a little bit. We've got this one for the background. It's that same sound from earlier that we've just, extended instead of chopped up. And then we've got this one for the background. This is yet another sound that was possibly intended to be the main sound, and then that never happened. The horns are completely made in, Serum. We've got, again, a lot of compression distortion, but it's just some FM'd gross growl and saw-ish thing. More distortion and compression, and then a sub underneath it. You don't really need to sound like horns for people to understand that it's a horn section. You hear that and you know, oh, that's meant to be a horn section. And it sounds a lot more intense this way. Obviously, no actual horn section is going to sound like that, but that's fine. That's the first half. The second half, we, again, slow it down a little bit, so... bring these down to half speed and just add a little bit more phaser, but it's essentially the same sound, and then we speed these up. So it's entirely an idea of having fast growls and long background elements, and then long growls and fast background elements, so that you can use basically the same sounds or tweak them a little bit and create something entirely different. You don't have to write that many sounds for the whole drop. You can just use the same sounds and flip their patterns and then adjust them a little bit and make the back half of the drop still sound familiar. That's pretty much the entire thing. At the end, we just reverb out these horns and we let the Yu-Gi-Oh monologue go a little bit. So the last thing to go over really is the drums. And the drums are pretty standard. There are a few little nuances with how I do some of the tricks that I do in them. But for the first drop, I know that I have the machine guns going really fast and adding a lot of that chaotic energy. So I wanted the drums to be very stompy and slow to give space for the machine guns to work between them without fighting. So you'll notice there's no hi-hats in the first drop. There's just the ride cymbals and the kick and the snare. One thing specifically about how I do this is that the kick, I have the reverse kick, which is a classic, but I do not have the kick go all the way up to the front of the kick or the transient. So I see a lot of people doing this sometimes, which is fine, but personally I don't like the sound that much. It's got that whip to it that I don't really like. So what I like to do is drag the kick back a little bit and then pull it up. So you've got the low end, but instead of climbing all the way to the transient and then back down, you go up maybe halfway, 3/4 of the way, and then the kick hits and brings the energy back down. So you still get the impact of the kick instead of the whip up. That's how I do reverse kicks. You can do reverse kicks however you want, but that's how it's done in this. And I assume you care because you're watching the video. So it's just ride cymbals for the rest of it, an odd crash to wash us out. In the second drop, everything changes, right? The Fire Nation attacks. So all of the patches get slower. There's no rapid fire machine guns in the second drop. So to replace that sort of quick stabby action, I do add a lot more hi-hats. So now the drums for the second drop sound like this. So it's a lot more pressure, a lot more, forward moving. These are just, standard hi-hat pattern stuff. The second half, so I take out one of the hi-hats. These hi-hats are pitched up and down, by the way, just to give it a little more variation. It's the same sample, I've just pitched it around. But what's important is you see these big gaps here. They all occur when I'm trying to highlight or emphasize something in the drop. So in this part, it's a horn. So there's no hat hitting there, and actually this ride even cuts out. So when we get there, it really emphasizes the horn. It feels like everything stops to make room for the horn. And then in this part, I have... So all the drums stop, reverb out, and then the ride starts to sweep back in, and then everything hits. So leaving gaps in the drums where you especially want to highlight something in the drop is a great technique to make something stand out more without feeling like you need to make it louder, because making it louder is going to make your mix down harder, and then you're clipping and blah, 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 blah. If you leave space in other elements, especially in the drums, it can really highlight the impact of a sound. I'm not going to really talk about the mixdown and mastering in this video, especially because this track is super messy and it's not a great example of how to properly do it, but also because that's a whole video in and of itself that I might do someday. For this one, that's pretty much all I have to say. Hopefully you learned a little bit about how I make something in this sort of style and how you might want to make something. If you do make something using some of these techniques, let me know. Send it to me. I want to hear it. If you want to see how I made the rest of the tracks on the Trials EP, I'm doing instructional videos for those as well, so you can find those on screen and in the description right now. And hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you.